Okay, so this is the audio review for The Self, the I, and the Me by George Herbert Mead. I know that his writing style can be a bit obtuse and it can be a little difficult to kind of clearly comprehend what he's trying to say, so I'm going to do my best to break it down, make it, more understandable. Okay, so first, distinguishing between the self and the body. So basically, he starts by saying that the body can act without the self involved in the experience, right? So, if you're doing things physiologically throughout your day, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily like narrating the experience or thinking really clearly about what you're doing. That the body sometimes does things, right, irrespective of the self, and other times the self really regulates what the body is doing. So anyway, he starts with this idea of the self as an object to itself. So again, I know this gets complicated, but first he talks about how from your eye, right, which is our real position on the world, we can only see so much of ourselves, right? Obviously mirrors help that, but without the sense of a mirror, your eye can only see like your arms, your legs, but it can't see your whole body. So he gives this table example where the parts of the body are distinguishable from the self. So he says how we can lose parts of our body, but that's not going to damage our self, right? We still have an internal sense of who we are, whether or not we lose an arm or a leg or something of that nature, right? So the ability to experience different parts of the body is not different from the experience of a table. So a table has different feel from what the hand does when one hand feels another. But it's still an experience of something with which we come in contact with. Meaning, when you see a table, when you interact or touch a table, it's a whole table, right? It does have different parts like, legs or whatever, but we experience it as a whole, which is something that we don't do really with ourselves. The body does not experience itself as a whole. So he's arguing that we have to make ourselves an object so that we can understand ourselves as a table or as something that exists outside of just where our brain looks outward through our eyeballs, right? So he says that the self are both subject and object. So the word self is reflexive and indicates that we can be both subject and object. So, like I was saying before, you can have experiences without yourself. So if you're running from someone who's chasing you, you're caught up in the action of, the physiology of your body. This is going to be separate from yourself. But sometimes flashes of memory can happen in these moments, which are, again, indications of and are tied to your self-identity. So his real question was, how can an individual get outside himself experientially to become an object to himself? So he argues that we do this by developing a sense of self. So individuals experience themselves as objects indirectly through the particular standpoints of other individual members of the same social group, or from the generalized standpoint of the social group as a whole to which the individual belongs. So when you're talking about communication in the sense of significant symbols, communication is directed at others and at the self. So individuals become objects when we address another person, and their responses become part of our conduct. So even when you're replying to yourself, you're still going through a process that is done socially outside of yourself, right? So if you're talking to yourself, talking is still something you learned through the social interaction process. So he says that we're not just a physiological body, that many people believe in the idea of ghosts is kind of the example he goes with here. So underlying the understanding of ghosts is a knowledge that a sense of self is separate from the body. So some think of it in a religious way like a soul, but the idea is we can see the self as separate from the body. So within reincarnation, we think of the essence of a person going into a different body, that the body is like a shell for consciousness. So the self is understood as separate from the bodily actions and functions of an individual, as a self is a social experience. So Mead argues that we can't have conversations with ourselves if we haven't learned to have them with others. So he also says that thinking, the process of thinking, is an inner conversation. So again, it may be talking to yourself, but in a way you're preparing for what's going to be said or expressed to other people. So you're addressing others as you're addressing yourself. So in the process of thinking, it shows that we have a self-identity because we're talking to ourselves, we're making ourselves an object, or we're seeing ourselves as something that could be understood as an individual in society. To complicate this a little more, we have different selves. So we carry on a whole series of different relationships to different people. We're one thing to one person and another to another. So some are our mentors, some are our mentees, right? Some people you drink with, while other people you would talk politics to, right? So there's parts of the self that exist only for the self in relationship to the self as well. But the idea is we have different selves and we divide ourselves into different selves. And these different selves have different groups whose behavior they take into our own sense of self. So basically, it's a social process that's responsible for the appearance of the self. Meaning, when we interact with these different people, they're going to give us their set of expectations and behaviors that they deem appropriate. And we're going to take that in through an interactional process. And that's going to affect the way that we develop our sense of self. So in a way, having multiple personalities is totally normal for us as people because we're different people to different groups in society, right? So you talk differently to your boss than you do to your friends, than you do to your parents, right? And so dissociation, he talks about, is when a person divides into two entirely different selves, dependent on the set of social reactions that's involved, to which, we're going to be. So he talks about how this may take place when someone experiences an emotional event. So what we know now from a lot of research that Mead was really theorizing at the time, but not really privy to, was how often those who face trauma or abuse often disassociate from those experiences in order to protect their inner sense of self. So sometimes while abuse or trauma is happening, the person is somewhere and someone else, right? And this is a mechanism that people use to try to survive terrible circumstances. So if you've seen the movie Precious, then you know they did an excellent job at showing how this can happen. As she's being sexually abused, she disassociates and she's a rock star. She's beloved by fans, right? She's far away in someone else. And this is a process that he was talking about in the way that the self would, disassociate because of its interactions with others. But we now know that especially trauma and things of that nature can really cause people to split into those kind of different selves and to become someone else in a sense to escape that trauma. So when it comes to the self in society, our various selves are organized into a complete self, and the selves are the result of the social processes of a whole. So the structure of the self reflects society as we fit ourselves to fit societal expectations. So when it comes to being rational, this rational society, the community's expectations for our behavior get into us as we interact with with each other within a particular culture. So what the culture deems as normal in actions becomes our normal. It's a rational process where we conform to what the societal expectations are. And through this generalized other, he's talking about how we learn society's values, so we develop an understanding of the expectations on our behavior as evidence in the phrase, what would people think? Or what would society think? Or what would they think, right? So not simply your close relationships, but an amalgamation of those whom you don't know, but you assume you know their values. That's the generalized other. So self-consciousness is a whole nother concept he talks about too. So to have self-consciousness, and here it more means an estimation of the self, not just the kind of negative self-evaluation we tend to think of nowadays when we think of being self-conscious. But the roots of it are there too, when you think about it. When we feel self-conscious in the modern sense, we're at odds with what we feel people think about us or how people see us. So we think of what we will do through this place of self-consciousness. As Mead argues, we must understand the values and attitudes of others in order to have this form of self-evaluation. Our actions are not controlled through physiology alone, but instead our actions are often motivated by the process of absorbing societal values and judging our actions as whether they would be favorable or not to the generalized other or to society. So he also talks about the idea of the me and the I. And this can get kind of complicated. So the me is the immediate experience of self, which is able to maintain itself in the community. And the I is the response of the individual to the attitude of the community as it appears in his own experience. And again, that's kind of his word, so that's why it's a bit obtuse. So the I is kind of the way we see ourselves as an external thing in society, though the me is kind of like from the eyeballs outward, how you see the world, your own personal experiences of things. You can't really escape the me, But when you have like a memory and you think of yourself in the context of your placement with others, you're thinking of the I, right? You've kind of developed what he considers this object that you can understand yourself as someone or something that interacts with others within the society. So it's kind of complicated, but it's kind of not. It's this idea that we understand our world through our eyeballs out, but we also understand a sense of ourselves from the way that we think that people see us or evaluate us.